So topic-wise that we're going to be covering for the agenda, we've got pretty much three core areas, and we've got an infographic that we're going to be using that kind of leads us along with this, is to really understand what are the differences in the licensing costs that we have between AX and D365, and how does that relate then to the software? Because I've heard many different things from prospects and customers in terms of the feedback with those licensing costs. And then past that, what's the infrastructure and IT resource costs that we need to be able to look at with this? Because there's obviously a shift with this in a cloud model that we need to understand, and that you can benefit from, obviously, as part of that cost shift. And potentially even some resource shifting in terms of what resources do within your organization. And then the final portion of this obviously is talking about those training cost aspects. Training obviously has some aspects that are harder when you go to a new system or you go to a new user interface, like we're seeing with finance and operations, but there are also tools that help you with that as part of that process. So the very first topic here, licensing, and this is our infographic that we've been sharing, and we'll have links to this at the end as well. As you can see, no two icebergs are the same, but you can see in here that the point that we're trying to get across with this is that when you're looking at what those costs of ownership are going to be for licensing, there's a lot more that you do not see as part of that when you actually go through your implementation of the actual product and even the maintenance of it as well. And what we're highlighting here is that while cloud may be more expensive for licensing, there's also other aspects of the cloud that are not covered, obviously, within on-premise. So to kind of talk to that, here's the comparing of licensing that we have with it. So the very first thing that we need to know is that we've got a new licensing model. Obviously, it's called subscription licensing. If you haven't read up on it, you should. The licensing itself, if you do like a cost comparison and you take it out for 4 years, one of the biggest feedback items I've seen is that everyone says, well, it's way more expensive than having a perpetual license or buying the software up front for $4,000 a user and then deploying it. But what they don't understand is the fact that that hardware and infrastructure cost is folded into that cloud license cost. And so when you're looking at it, know that your licensing cost, you can't compare it in an apples to apples perspective with that, because there is differences on the infrastructure and resource requirements that you have in your organization. There's also the aspect that licensing is actually applied towards more than one product too. So when you start looking at some of the licensing, you can buy each individual product if you want to, but you can also get enterprise licensing that allows for you then to use D365 FinOps or Finance and Operations, or Dynamics 365 for sales. We use a lot of different acronyms here, as you can tell. But the net result is that that can actually drive then some additional value for you as part of that licensing. And then lastly, obviously, you can pay for what you need. That's a big thing. There are some agreements that you can have with Microsoft, like with enterprise agreements, that don't allow you to do that, but there are others. There's something called Cloud CSP that Ron can probably talk to a little bit, but it allows you to adapt to your business in terms of those user counts very easily and effectively. So those are some of the major differences that are there. Ron, I didn't know if you had anything else that you wanted to add to this.
Sure. No, I think one of the things to really think about when you're looking at this, many of you may or may not be on what's called an enterprise agreement. And an enterprise agreement with Microsoft is essentially you're paying for licenses typically upfront for a period monthly, but for a period of anywhere from 1 to 3 years. There's a monetary or there is some value there in terms of the licensing, because often if you're on an EA that's a volume agreement, you're going to probably find the prices to be a bit less than in what we call a CSP model. The value of a CSP model, while it might be a little bit more per seat, the value is that you can actually upgrade or downgrade those licenses. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well, about how you can go from a more expensive license down to a more affordable license based on what those roles are.
Awesome. So just something to know, when you're looking at the licensing, start thinking about other options that you have now with other products, and those other costs that maybe you should be looking at as part of the comparison. The hardware cost that you have, the resource utilization cost, all those should be compared as part of that for the maintenance of the actual system. So the other area that we look at then with this, obviously, as we're digging into this, is going to be the infrastructure and resource costs that we have, the actual hardware that we're maintaining, that we have to upgrade, that all of a sudden we have to have a major increase in hardware because we didn't scale it correctly, potentially, as an example, the patches, the maintenance, the upgrades. Those are all aspects as well that need to be considered with this. And as you can see, I try to highlight here, those are in the licensing now as well. The infrastructure is Azure, the maintenance is maintained by Microsoft, so patches and updates to the actual server platform are being maintained. And then also, if you think about it, because you're not then maintaining that specific hardware on site, you don't have that server rack and all that infrastructure, those roles that you have internally that are maintaining that can be potentially tasked with other support roles inside of your organization. And I just want to highlight that is that we're not looking at, some companies love to talk about headcount reduction. I am totally, against that, and saying that people can be realigned potentially to be able to assist with the business to help them from a more supportive role moving forward potentially. And then lastly as well, from an infrastructure perspective, let's say you wanted to do a disaster recovery site. Let's say that you wanted to spin up a larger instance of FinOps to help with some scalability because maybe you had a hot product that came out and all of a sudden you've got just tons of orders that are coming in. With Azure and with the infrastructure, you can just scale it up, obviously, as part of that. But from your perspective inside of AX, especially when it's on-prem, you've got to buy all that new hardware with it. So remember that those infrastructure and resource costs should be considered as part of your comparison between AX and D365 from the licensing perspective as well.
I think the other thing to add to that, to be thinking about, is when you have this infrastructure available to you through Azure, it also gives you the ability to be able to really leverage some of those Power Apps, in particular Power BI. When you think about the amount of data that's out there that can be consumed and brought in for you to use in terms of determining, making decisions, that you might want as an organization moving forward, the Azure servers and the data centers can be powered up. You can leverage more horsepower in a matter of seconds to be able to support that amount of data that you wouldn't have been able to do with your own in-house servers in the past. So there's a lot of advantages there as well.
Yep, absolutely. So just something to note, and we're trying to highlight the cost comparisons for you that are actually as many real world examples as possible as part of this. And then finally, obviously, the training cost. I mean, I have heard many different stories from an AX 2009 to an AX 2012 upgrade, and the pain and understanding and relearning a role center and all those different concepts that are in there without having really good tools to help you through that process. So from the training perspective, I mean, you hear this every time, and I know, but I just want to argue a little bit towards it and say, hey, wait a second. When I started using Dynamics 365, I was happy that I was actually able to interact in a modern user interface for the time, because all the other software applications that we have are generally updating, right? Our phones are updating all the time, and the user interfaces are reflecting the feedback of the generation. And so from my perspective, and from what I've seen from other customers as well, is that modern type of look and feel makes it easier for people to understand, because it aligns then towards what that expectation is of software for that generation. You go back 30 years ago and you had green screens, people were happy with that. They were able to use it for those job processes. But if you did that now, it would not be conducive to business for you long term. So just something to note with that. The other aspect of this is that you can actually access the actual application from anywhere now. As long as you have internet access, you can access that information. So people can actually set up training environments that people can access externally, so that way you can ramp up your actual internal subject matter experts much easier and faster. And then there's also a couple of new tools that have been added to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. We've had the task recorder in prior versions, but we haven't had a task recorder that guides us step by step in a process on how to actually do the creation of a new warehouse or the creation of a sales order in the system. So that's a very powerful feature that really helps prospects and customers understand understand then when they're doing a new rollout or an upgrade that they can actually do this process using this specific task recording. And then the other big thing I just want to highlight here, a lot of ERP systems, if you want to go online and look up SAP documentation, have fun trying to find it. You have to pay for SAP for that documentation, or Oracle, or a lot of the other players that are out there. But as you've noticed, probably with TechNet and with all the documentation that's available for Dynamics 365, it's publicly available. If I have a question on a particular process in projects, for example, I can click on it to get to that information, and it's reflective then of the current modern user interface that we're using. So that online documentation that Microsoft is maintaining, while it may not be just a one-click experience to get to it, is a very powerful tool that you can use to stay current and then also help train your people on how to use functionality inside of the application. So that was, I think we're getting to time right here. Ron, I don't know if you had anything else with training costs that you wanted to add to that as well.
No, I think the biggest point in here is that task recorder. That's one of the things that we've witnessed when demonstrating the software to companies that are entertaining the idea of either upgrading or looking at the FinOps software as a net new solution, is that that seems to have the biggest wow factor. And the reason why it's a wow factor is because it really gives the end user the opportunity to be able to go back without having to rely on documentation, without having to rely on your memory, and go through and run those tasks, go through those processes, and do them in the order that's been configured for your organization, not necessarily, as an out-of-the-box type of recorder, although there are many of them. You can actually create these recordings that would be specific to what the processes are for your particular organization, and use those for new employees when they come in, or just as refreshers for those that are maybe going through and doing a year-end close. Those processes aren't done that frequently, so it's really a valuable tool.
Yep, absolutely.